Union Theological Seminary, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the Episcopal Divinity School Unions at Union's Spring Community Read Lecture. Tonight we're going to hear from Anna Clark, the author of The Poisoned City, Flint's Water, and the American Urban Tragedy. This devastating public crisis is not isolated to Flint, and other cities, including our own and the many from which we come, should take note. So I'm very much looking forward with all of you to hearing from Anna Clark. So now it's my great privilege to introduce to you tonight's host and moderator, my good friend, my dear friend, the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the Dean of EDS at Union. Dean Douglas is the first African American and the first African American female to be named Dean of an Episcopal seminary, period. She is many, many things. She is a brilliant theologian, an accomplished and award-winning author. She is a teacher, bar none. She is a leader of incredible vision and courage. She is the theologian in residence at Trinity Wall Street here in New York City. She is so many things, and we are very lucky to have her with us here, having chosen this book, having gathered the students, to now bring us the author and facilitate our conversation about this crucial public issue. Kelly?
Well, you can tell that Dr. Serene Jones is my good friend because she's told all those lies. It is my privilege to be here at Union with my dear friend Serene Jones, and to be here tonight and to have Anna Clark here with us. I thank all of you for coming out on this frigid night for what will be, I think, an important conversation with Anna Clark. Her comprehensive book, Look at the Flint Water Crisis in the Poisoned City, is both riveting and deeply distressing. It is why we selected it as our spring community read for here at EDS at Union. It was required reading for our students. Now, before I introduce Ms. Clark, let me share how you can take part in this conversation in the question and answer session after the lecture. As you may have noticed when you came in, there was a note card in your seat. If you didn't notice, you're sitting on it. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please write it on the card, and we will have someone collect them just as we are beginning the Q&A portion of the program. For those of you who are live streaming at home, we invite you as well to join into the Q&A by tweeting your question to us at EDS at Union. We will try to get to as many of those questions as time allows. Now about our guest tonight. Anna Clark is a journalist who lives in Detroit. In fact, she's a native Michigander and graduated from the University of Michigan's Residential College with highest honors. And I'm from Ohio, so that will be the last time that I mention that school up north. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Politico, and Elle magazine, among other publications. Her book, The Poisoned City, won a State History Award and was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. The New York Times review of the book called it a comprehensive chronicle of the crisis, with an eye for the institutional corruption and indifference that enabled it. And USA Today said it's hard to overstate how important Anna Clark's new book is. And on that point, I wholeheartedly agree. Please welcome this evening, Anna Clark.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's so great to be here. I mean, I literally, my plane landed at like 12:30, and ever since I've been wowed. And it's not just the Midwesterner and the big city. It's this really beautiful, compassionate community that I get the honor of being with this evening. So thank you all to the people who made this happen, and thank you for coming out on an evening that is brisk. Oh, and one other, I just wanted to mention this too. It's a little bit separate from the book, but like one reason I think I feel especially excited to be here is because, you know, I feel like I've been, throughout my life, been drawn to communities that have been trying to sit at that meeting point between like intellectualism and spirit and the world, you know, like, and I lived for a few years at a community in Boston called Haley House, which was founded more than 50 years ago based on the Catholic worker movement and liberation theology and Buddhism, and very ecumenical in a way, and very practical in how it's trying to meet needs in the community. And when I got to Detroit in 2007, one of my first encounters was with the philosopher Grace Lee Boggs, who spent her life, you know, right, like kind of like trying to cultivate the beloved community in this in a city that many had left for dead, and that's ever since in my life in the city that's, you know, stayed with me. So anyway, this is all to say that I feel very connected here and very glad to be here. So thank you. What I wanted to talk about this evening is how cities are made and unmade, and how this has played out with an unbearable degree of drama and urgency in Flint, Michigan. But first, I want to give us some perspective. So we literally panned out. Michigan, it's where I grew up, and it's of course made of two distinctive peninsulas, like literally shaped by the Great Lakes. When you're a school kid in Michigan, you learn the names of these lakes by a mnemonic: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior, or Holmes. There is lakes is sometimes like a misnomer. They're really inland seas. They're huge. There's so much water that if you spilled it out over the lower 48, it would fill the Grand Canyon before settling at an even depth of 10 feet. They hold more than 20% of all the fresh water on the face of the earth. Michigan can also boast of like having more coastline than any state except Alaska. And this is just the lakes themselves, like not even counting for like the wealth of inland lakes and rivers and ponds and streams. This is a very watery place. And they're beautiful. They're absolutely gorgeous. Like, besides being the underpinning of the economy and the drinking water supply for many, many millions of people in two different countries, they hold a really powerful psychic place for a psychic place in like the emotional life of folks who grow up there. And that's true whether you're in a big city like Chicago, or up in like the rural rocky northern coast, or around these like sandy small town beaches and dunes, which little Anna was fortunate enough to grow up around. And yet somehow even in this place that has like a wealth of fresh water, an entire city was poisoned. Like, they're literally poisoned through their drinking water. And it wasn't for a short time, it was for a long time. It wasn't because of some kind of natural disaster. This was a decidedly man-made crisis. And it didn't even follow that usual pattern that many of us are familiar with when it comes to environmental injustices. I mean, it wasn't some kind of company that was blinded by profits, that was cutting corners. In this case, it was actually the public agencies who have no evident profit motive and are charged with protecting the common good that were the ones that made the choices that both caused and prolonged this water disaster in Flint. But before I go too much further, I want to bring a little bit of the spirit of this city into the space. Maybe some folks are from there or have been there, but just in case, you know, Flint is an amazing place, you know? I mean, a lot of times we get into, when we talk about a city like Flint, we get into this chronicle of loss, you know? It's lost people, it's lost industry, it's lost public services, it's lost democracy, and we don't always talk about what is actually there. So, what is there? There are today almost 100,000 people who live in the city and many, many more who come into town to work. It is a river town, you know, founded at a crossing point between the city of Detroit and the city of Saginaw. It's about 70 miles from Lake Huron in one direction and 70 miles from the Saginaw Bay in the other. The bay is this, not just, you know, Simon and Garfunkel reference, it's also, you know, it's like this very specific watery space that makes Michigan a mitten. And in Flint, if you go there, you will find the very lively Good Beans Cafe, which is a neighborhood hub. If you are me, you will spend a lot of time there. Over in the Cultural Center, you're going to find this very beautiful, sunny public library that is many different kinds of people make use of. Downtown, you'll see a very distinctively modernist city hall with this kind of futuristic dome, which is where they hold public meetings, including many of the meetings that played out at critical junctures in the Flint story. Over on the north side, there's this historic field house called Burston that a former school teacher has been reviving. It's a place where a number of kids from Flint have found their calling, not least the boxer Clarissa Shields, a two-time gold medalist that Flint is very proud of. On Sundays in the summer, it's basically a neighborhood festival. They have an intramural softball league that has a lot of attention, and it's really fun to just hang out there. Flint also has the largest planetarium in the state. That's where I watched the eclipse back in 2017. It was great. It has 4 college campuses, including the University of Michigan's Flint campus. That's the university up north from the university up north. One of the community's great success stories is that farmers market right there, which is actually, that was a former newspaper printing plant that they revived into a really, really popular farmers market. And of course, Flint, this river town amidst the Great Lakes, is also home to one of the greatest public health disasters in recent memory. Most of the timelines of the water crisis begin here on this day. This is April of 2014. This is the day of this infamous water switch and a particular press conference that everybody in these images sorely regrets. The gist of the water crisis, and I'm going to give you the short story, is that, you know, the city of Flint had been drinking water from Lake Huron via the Detroit Water Department for about 50 years. The water quality was very good, but there was a growing restlessness because of the expensiveness of this water, particularly for residents. Flint residents were paying some of the most expensive water bills in the country before we even account for the fact that it was a disproportionately poor community. So there was, you know, just a plague of water shutoffs and water prosecutions, you know, when people had illegal hookups, and just growing fury about this. It was absolutely untenable. And the city, in a very impoverished place, was deemed to be in such a state that the state felt it needed to send an emergency manager to hold all the political power in the city. Emergency managers in Michigan are state appointees sent to struggling cities or school districts. While present, they have like truly sole authority. In a city like Flint, they would have the full power of the mayor's office and all the city council's office, and additional powers that are beyond any of those offices. So they can unilaterally sell city assets, for example, or make or break union contracts. In Flint, which had a number of stints with emergency management, but pertinent for the water crisis, they had four four consecutive ones over 3.5 years that was effectively the duration of all the decisions that made this water crisis happen. So one of them signed a deal to leave the Detroit water system, and they decided they were going to join a brand new water system. But this brand new water system wasn't built yet. It wasn't going to be ready to deliver water for about 2 or 3 years. And even when it was, Flint was going to have to treat it itself. So another emergency manager decided that the thing they wanted to do was to spend the interim period treating their own water from the Flint River. They were going to reboot the old plant, and they were going to treat the water themselves. And this was really celebrated, as you can see, like with this grand toast of the river water. And it wasn't just the people, the emergency manager and the council members and the mayor and people with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, all of whom you can see here, that celebrated this. Others did too. I mean, it was really, the narrative of this was that this was a way for the city to regain its self-sufficiency, its sovereignty. We can take care of ourselves. Now, one of the myths about the water crisis is that the river itself was so polluted that it made people sick. And it's not true, though there's seeds of truth in this. It's true that the Flint River, like a lot of urban waterways, was terribly, terribly treated throughout the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1970s when there was any restrictions at all on what you could dump into the water. So especially in a company town like Flint, the birthplace of General Motors, it was effectively just an open sewer. And so generations of Flint kids grew up with warnings, right? Like to never swim in the water and never eat fish that you catch from it. It was in a bad place. But the good news is that we do have the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and we have had 50 years, I guess, of deindustrialization in Flint. And the fact is, the water is healthier now than it's been in a very long time. There's challenges, but it's quite beautiful, really. But the crisis, it wasn't so much the water itself, but it's how we treated the water, or didn't treat the water, more accurately. Basically, the water plant, that rebooted old water plant, did not receive the kind of upgrades or the staffing necessary to treat a more complex water source. And the most serious gap is that they didn't treat it with something called corrosion control. And this was breaking federal law. Corrosion control is what you're supposed to add to the water at a treatment plant so that when the water passes through the pipes, which throughout most of America is very old and often made out of lead, it helps keep the pipes from breaking down into the water and contaminating it by the time we turn on the tap. It's not a perfect solution. We absolutely need a robust, comprehensive infrastructure investment plan, but it helps a lot. So in Flint, the river, like any river, it was more corrosive than Lake Huron water. And unlike the water from Detroit, it wasn't treated with corrosion control. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out what would happen. You have a more corrosive water source, you're not treating it with corrosion control. So what happens is corroded pipes. And these are actual pipes from Flint that began breaking down as the water passed through them. When you saw images of people holding up bottles of brown or orange colored water, that was actually iron, that was rust that had fallen, broken down into the water. What you couldn't see was the lead because it's invisible, but it was definitely the most dangerous. Lead is one of the world's best known neurotoxins, and it was a terrible mistake to build drinking water systems out of it. While Flint's most known for the lead crisis, that was one of only a series of problems that followed from the water switch. There was also a spate of E. coli bacteria issues. There was rashes and hair loss that were never really explained. There was a cancer-causing disinfection byproduct that got into the water and was also violating federal law. And there was a 2-year outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that was not made public. Legionnaire's disease is a type of pneumonia that it is especially serious, especially intense, and you get it when you breathe in a waterborne bacteria, like during a shower or a bath, like you would breathe in the vapor. Lead causes permanent incurable damage, especially to children and infants, but it's the Legionnaire's disease that actually killed people. So to walk through a Great Lakes city and see signs like this at every turn is a very peculiar kind of betrayal. This water crisis, it invaded the most intimate spaces of people's lives, right? It invaded their family meals and the formula they're feeding their infants. It's like their very bodies, right? And there's one Flint mom who said that, she was, looking back, she was just trying to be a good parent, She was urging her kids to drink water and trying to steer them away from juice and soda. And to find out that that water all along could cause toxic permanent brain damage is absolutely haunting. But I'm going to back up even further for a moment. One thing I tried to do with this book is to make clear that while a very particular sequence of events followed that water switch, that is not actually when this water crisis started. This is Flint in the 1960s. This is when the city was absolutely booming. Its population had been going up, 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 up. At the time, it thought it was going to grow ever more. That's one reason why they connected to Detroit's water system during that decade. They wanted to make sure they had capacity to support all their growing development. It had about 200,000 people, numbers that had more than doubled in the decades just previous. And, and the reason people were coming to the city is because they could get great jobs. They could get great jobs, really good, well-paying, stable jobs, largely with General Motors here in the city where it was founded. And it was also well known for other things too. It was well known for this community schools movement that was very pioneering. It was where it activated public schools, neighborhood schools, and turned them into, basically, recreation centers and social service centers, and they used the schools beyond just the K through 12 classroom time and made them like true neighborhood pubs. It was also a really pretty community. They had 11 people working in just their forestry division. I mean, it was a very beautiful city. And Flint was also super segregated. It was one of the most segregated cities in the country. In fact, it was literally by one measure, the most segregated city in the north and the third most segregated city nationwide. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with how this is enforced, but whether it was through restrictive covenants that is specifically kept people of different races and ethnicities out of most neighborhoods, or whether it was realtors who were only white because they only allowed white people into their club, refusing to show certain homes and keeping up this racial line, or of course the federal practices of making home mortgages and insurance only available to white people. It was these lines were tightly held. So in Flint, super segregated Flint, there was only 2 neighborhoods you could live in if you're African American, and one was St. John on the north and Floral Park just on the south. But Flint's black population had quintupled thanks to the Great Migration. And beside the sheer unfairness of it all, it was becoming utterly untenable to try to keep these 2 neighborhoods what they were, right? They're bursting at the seams. People were sick and tired of not being able to live wherever they wanted, and they were pushing for a fair housing ordinance that would allow them choices and freedom and human rights, I would say. They had an important ally in the mayor, Floyd McCree, who was what I believe is the first African-American mayor of any major American city, though at the time it was more like a city council president, and he was appointed rather than elected. So caveat, but it was still a pretty big deal, and he got a lot of national press for it when it happened. This is from a huge spread that was in Jet magazine. He worked at a Buick foundry. He lived in St. John. And when he came to become mayor, especially in this like very viciously segregated city, it really gave a jolt to the fair housing movement that was rising here. So the city commission, had been delaying a vote on one over and over and over and over. They just never really wanted to be held to account for this. But people were getting more and more unsatisfied with the status quo. Which brings us to July 1967. So this is when the whole world seemed like it was exploding. So just after, the same month, July 1967, just after Newark was rocked with this like deadly rebellion, so too was Detroit in 5 fiery days that ultimately killed more than 40 people, mostly African Americans, and burned 2,000 buildings and created a legacy that I will say as a fact is still very, very present in the city today. What's less well known is that same week that Detroit was afire, it was like little embers got sent out to smaller cities like throughout Michigan, including Grand Rapids and Pontiac and the city of Flint. So what happened there is that there was this fair housing rally in North Flint, right near where those softball games were played, right near that field house. And it died down, and then there was a couple of teenagers who hung around afterwards, and they started getting aggressive, and they threw things, and things exploded. The governor at the time, George Romney, who is, yes, Mitt's dad, he declared a state of emergency. 102 people were arrested the first night. But one thing that was unusual about what happened in Flint is that the mayor worked with the county prosecutor and came up with a deal. All 102 people who were arrested were going to be released with no charges, so long as they helped keep the peace the following night. And despite eyebrows that couldn't be raised any higher by many people, it actually worked. It worked, Flint's riot died down after 2 days. No serious injuries were reported. And the city commission finally agreed to vote on this fair housing ordinance. So Mayor McCree, he gets up there at this meeting, it's August 1967, and he makes his big plea. He's like, look, I fought in World War II. My brother fought in World War II. Our father fought in World War I. And yet the people we fought against can come to Flint and buy any home they want. And we can't, And he's like, please, I urge you to take this stand here. So the commission listened, they voted, comes out 5-3 against fair housing. Segregation's still going to be the policy. The mayor was absolutely disgusted, and he weeps as he speaks. He's like, when I was appointed mayor, and 9 months ago, and we got all this national attention for how progressive Flint is, how forward-thinking Flint is. Everybody thought that was great, very well, very fine, very good. He's like, but I can't do this anymore. He's like, I cannot keep living this equal opportunity lie. And he quits right there. In solidarity, a lot of other people quit with him. And as you can see, these are New York Times pieces. It's beginning to get national attention here. This standstill, around the fair housing question seemed unbreakable. The mayor, former mayor, he's hospitalized with an ulcer and exhaustion. His 23-year-old nephew comes to visit him, and they start talking. It's like, what do we even do? How do we move forward from here? This is so depressing. They come up with this idea for a sleep-in on the lawn of City Hall, that domed building. The nephew, the 23-year-old nephew, starts rallying up a bunch of people. They bring out their sleeping bags. They camp out there. And despite, people patrolling them with guns, despite sprinklers being turned on, they stay. And they say they're not going to leave until the commission takes up the fair housing ordinance once again. And they get a lot of attention for this, even a 10-minute segment on the National Huntley-Brinkley report that some people might know. And as more attention came, more people came, and it was putting more and more pressure on the city to reflect on itself. And one thing that I think is really striking about Flint in particular is how these folks organizing for fair housing were playing out what I see as like a tradition that had been passed down for generations in Flint. These are images from the 1936-1937 sit-down strike at 3 of GM's plants. It was effectively the founding of the United Auto Workers. Side note, I found out that my great-grandfather was one of these people. I didn't know this until I was working on this book. Isn't that cool? It wasn't a story that was like told to my family, but my grandma was literally born in the midst of this 44-day strike that brought what was then one of the most powerful companies on the planet to a standstill. And they won. They won not just like better pay and better working conditions, but they also won the right to collectively bargain, which created the United Auto Workers and totally transformed the 20th century for well beyond Flint's own borders. And you could see this tradition of community organizing come back up a generation later with these civil rights activists, and we're going to see it come up later again with the water activists, the water and democracy activists. So those kids who were sleeping in, those young adults who were sleeping in on City Hall were supported by 5,000 people who came out for a unity rally, led not just by supporters of the mayor and other, civil rights leaders in Flint, but also Republican Governor George Romney, who turned out to be a really huge supporter of fair housing. And this was getting to a breaking point. So the city commission's like, fine, we'll vote. It's a watered down ordinance, but they take it up again, and by a hair, they pass it, right? Huge news. In the super segregated city, like a fair housing ordinance passes. That's tremendous victory for the people who had been working for this. But it was bittersweet. Within 5 minutes, a petition was taken up by opponents of the Fair Housing Ordinance, including 50 known members of the Ku Klux Klan. They take up a petition to get the ordinance on the ballot and overturn it. And they quickly do get enough signatures, so the ordinance is suspended. The mayor, who had returned to office, with the passage of the ordinance, takes leave from his job at the Buick foundry and starts working with this interracial coalition to kind of stand up for this fair housing ordinance. And in February of 1968, 40,000 people in Flint go to the polls, and by only 30 votes, 30 by the recount, it passes. And this is a big deal. This is the first community in America that passes a fair housing fair housing ordinance by popular vote. Similar ones had come up in cities like Seattle and Tacoma and Toledo and Akron and other places, Berkeley, but they failed at the ballot box. Nationally, at the time, it seemed like a fair housing ordinance was never going to be voted on. It was similar to the commission, just delayed. It took the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. before that was fast-tracked. So Flint, this again, infamously segregated city, suddenly has this, puts itself out there in a really profound way. And it's a lot to be proud of, but it too is bittersweet. That vote happened in 1968. 2 years later, the 1970 census marks the first downturn in Flint's population ever. It was, one might imagine, not a total coincidence that with the rise of fair housing laws and school desegregation laws, people started moving elsewhere. And in fact, white people were moving elsewhere and were incentivized by increasing support and subsidies and policies that made that possible, in fact, made it preferable for so many families. So Flint today has about the same population it has in 1920, or had in 1920, but you can see the racial dynamics have dramatically shifted. So Flint today is about 56% African American, about 40% white, and the balance is mostly Latinos. And it is also one of the poorest cities in the country. Decades of policies that disinvested in the city, that set it up for failure at the expense of the outskirts communities, have had their effect. We've concentrated our poverty in Flint. So therefore, in many ways, I don't think we should be surprised when, in fact, it is more vulnerable. So if you walk around Flint today, you're going to see these like beautiful historic homes. You know, you could see this like legacy of the auto wealth of the past in neighborhoods that are more dense, more middle class or even wealthy, and mostly white. And you're also going to see, you know, a tremendous amount of vacancy, right? I mean, this is like when a city loses more than half its population, plus those huge companies that took up just vast swaths of the real estate, they leave their remains behind, and you can see them. It's very visible. It's everywhere you look. You know, vacant homes and vacant lots and vacant company plots. There's just you can feel the space there of them. In Flint, you know, it had a drinking water system built to support not just 200,000 people and a huge industrial sector, but what they imagined would be ever more growth. In fact, it went the opposite direction, but the infrastructure didn't shrink along with the population. And this brings us to kind of back to the water crisis. Those bills were so expensive for people in Flint because, you know, fewer people are shouldering the burden of a system that's still built for, you know, many more. It was not just huge, but it was falling apart. It was they were losing like 50% of their water just through leaks, which of course made it more expensive on top of that. And it also like. It also this pattern, this disinvestment in this city, the way the city has been shrinking. It also shows how, while the water crisis affected everybody in Flint and didn't affect everybody equally, people who lived in neighborhoods that had more vacancy had literally worse water. And the reason is because when you have water passing through corroding pipes, it moves more slowly when it's moving through vacant spaces, right? It's just huge pipes, not as many people turning on their taps, you know, so it just sits longer, it moves more slowly, and it has time to get more saturated. So the folks in Flint who lived in neighborhoods with more vacancy, the poorer ones, and disproportionately people of color, were more vulnerable to worse water. You know, the water activists in Flint will tell you, you know, like they really, you know, emphasize that how terrible as a water crisis it was, it did bring everybody together because everybody was affected, and that's true, but it's the patterns of how infrastructure inequality has harmed some groups of people more than others is playing out now as it ever did in the past, despite the changes in the letters of our law. And it brought us to the point where, like, I mean, I've been thinking about this for 3 years, and I'm not over it yet. Like, it brought us to the point where this entire city is like, well before the state acknowledged any problems, was trying to, like, was reduced to kind of like, you know, trading bottled water back and forth and trying to check in on each other. I mean, what's beautiful about this city is how much they were looking after each other, you know, like before they even understood what was going on, before anything was acknowledged. People were hosting like bottled water drives and trying to, you know, create maps of symptoms to try to get a sense of what was going on. They were going door to door canvassing, just trying to share information and collect information. They were trying to take care of each other. And that was crucial because nobody else was. And this is what led us to this problem. Another myth about the water crisis is that, you know, that this is like, it took, like this crisis like was going on for like a year and a half, and it wasn't until outsiders came and like told them what happened that they realized it. And again, it's not true. Like they're very involved, you know, from the very beginning in making themselves visible, despite a number of policies that diminish them, you know, literally taking away the power of their local vote, despite the dismissive and even belittling attitude that their complaints were received with. I mean, just, you can look back at the records, like literally just like 2 weeks after the water switch, people are like calling like the EPA even and being like, something's weird with this water, you know? And again and again and again, they're told it's just fine. There's a General Motors engine plant in Flint, still in Flint. Within 5 months of the water switch, the water was so bad, it was like corroding their machinery, like rusting their machinery to the point that they had to leave the city's water and attach to a suburbs water source that still got its water from Detroit. And this created no small amount of headlines. There's a huge loss of revenue for the city. It was also quite symbolic and alarming, and a lot of residents were like, if it's not good enough for these machines, like, why is it okay for my body? But again and again, they're told, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. It took a year after the water switch, or that GM's water switch, before the state acknowledged it. It can't be emphasized enough, like, how this crisis was both caused and prolonged by the fact that people, a number of people with power, decided that what the wisdom that these people had, the authority they had even of their own lives, did not matter. It did not, it was not to be believed, and it was not to be given any empowered expression. And like, even just saying that, after thinking about this for a long time, like, puts chills down my spine, because it's a terrible, it's just terrible. And it's like, and the betrayal of that is even when the pipes are all fixed, the betrayal of that is going to last a lifetime. Another way that folks in the community of Flint have been really engaged, besides just passing out bottled water and trying to find out the truth of what was going on with this series of contamination issues, there have been a lot of folks who have been deeply, deeply engaged with what I would consider the roots of the problem, and are invested in building a more inclusive and equitable and visionary model for what a city can be. So one community I talk a lot about in the book is Civic Park in North Flint. This is a community that was built by General Motors, literally constructed by General Motors 100 years ago this year. It was one of America's first subdivisions. You can see here in this New York Times, like, this is like a mention of it. They didn't refer to the neighborhood itself, but it's GM building these like 1,000 homes for like World War I veterans that they hope to lure to the city to work in their factories. And they were very cute homes. They were like lovely single-family homes, curving boulevards, beautiful trees, and explicitly whites only. Over the decades, Civic Park, first of all, became a pretty, prominent community. A lot of like well-known people from Flint grew up there, including the current congressman who represents the area. But it also became, then it later became, well out of downtown. It became increasingly impoverished and disinvested in. Those pictures of vacant homes came from Civic Park. It's also majority African American now, and it is fortunate enough to have a center, an anchor institution in the Joy Tabernacle community and their urban Renaissance ministry. These are folks who moved into, used to be a Presbyterian church. They moved in there about 10 years ago or so. It's a huge building, and they don't have the resources to totally keep it all up. They've been trying to raise money for the sanctuary, but they're based there. And besides, being a spiritual community, with services in a traditional fashion, they're very, very, very involved in the neighborhood and are, creating a model of, within the bones of this GM-built, segregated, impoverished, disinvested neighborhood, within the bones of that, they're creating something new and, to me, very inspiring. They are, for example, rehabbing a lot of the vacant homes and turning them into little hubs that can meet community needs. That one is the Health and Wellness Center. There's another home that's where they have like kind of an urban farm outside it on a vacant lot, and inside the house you can learn things like canning, and other like kitchen techniques. They are fixing up these homes with the help of like apprenticeship programs that are giving skills and work opportunities for a lot of the young men in the neighborhood, which the pastor is especially an advocate for. He feels like these are like, you know, young folks that people have a very particular idea of, a stereotype of, and just and having, in addition to how they're conceiving of themselves, he sees the visibility of them working on these houses. He sees as a really powerful kind of prophetic presence. Yeah, I mean, I think like what they're doing in so many ways is one of the things that gives me hope for Flint's future, right? You know, like this isn't just a city where things happen to, where bad things happen. It is a city that people want to be in. Not everybody, you know, like some folks want to leave and can't. And that's part of the legacy of the water crisis too. That's very, very challenging, how it's dealt with property values and all that. But there's a lot of folks who love it and who have been working very, very, very hard for the city itself and for the people in it, and going beyond meeting basic needs, which is a heroic enough in a city that has been stripped of so much, but taking it a step further to like imagining entirely new models for how we can be together, you know, that's a more welcoming and inclusive structure for how we all live together. And that doesn't go away, right? That stays with me, and they're still very active in Flint. So I guess I just want to end by saying I think if Flint's water crisis has anything good come out of it, I hope it is one that is I hope that it is one that like creates a way for the rest of us throughout the country and even the world to reconsider our idea of the common good, what cities are for in the first place, who is in our community, and how do we articulate that in our policies and in our habits and in our infrastructure, like how we can think about our communities in ways that are more ecological, you know, like learning from our waterways, like in how things are cyclical and deserve our vigilance, and how how you can't silo it out, you know, like despite our best efforts to keep dividing ourselves up into haves and haves not, we learn again and again how our fates are interconnected, and in Flint this played out in usually dramatic fashion, but it's a pattern that is all over the country, and I think it's a lesson that all of us might take to heart. I mean, that congressman who grew up in Civic Park, one of the things he likes to say is like, Flint isn't just a worst case scenario, it's a warning. And it might be one that might be our fuel to think differently and act differently in our own communities, or it might not. Like, I think we're still kind of in that window time where I'm not really sure what its legacy is. But I'm excited to reflect on it and consider it and think about it and talk about it with you and learn more about this particular community. So thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Is it on? Thank you very much, and thank you for a very informative talk for all of us, and a very powerful book. And it leads us to think about the water crisis and the environmental crisis in a more complex and comprehensive way. And so I want to jump right in and asking a couple of questions, and then hopefully we will have some questions as well from our audience. You say when we think about environmental justice, and quote your book, we must talk about the relationship between place, pollution, and power. In this book, water becomes a metaphor in many respects for the way in which we are all connected, but it also becomes a metaphor for the way in which we are divided in this country. And in this respect, what happened in Flint is a 21st century manifestation, and you talk about the Kerner Report, that made clear that we live in a divided white and black America. And you've pointed out in this book how the divide of race defines the reality of environmental justice, so that you have said that if we're going to address issues of environmental justice, we must also address issues of racial justice. And if we talk about environmental injustice, we cannot talk about that apart from racial injustice. Yet, we see that this is not the case in terms of many of our environmental justice movements, right? Or racial justice movements. These things don't come together. And so I wanted to ask you, as you've done this work and lived with this for a long time and have seen the way in which these things interact, yet the way in which we approach these issues, and particularly this issue of the environment and the environmental crisis, how do we begin to bridge this divide? How do we begin to bring these two movements of racial justice and environmental justice together?
Starting with the easy one, I see. No, that's powerful and important. And I'm glad you brought up the Kerner Report too. I mean, we just went through its like 50th anniversary year, right? So everybody, I'm sure, like probably caught at least some of the sort of reflection and how far we come and revisiting that. But I read the entire thing. And it is actually amazing how much that it predicted would happen did actually happen. They could see it came out in 1968, so the same year, as, in fact, just like 5 weeks after that fair housing vote in Flint. It was, and it talks a lot about fair housing and segregation, and talks about how this, this center cannot hold, and how this is, we're setting a pattern of like hollowing out our core cities and exacerbating our separateness in ways that are going to hurt everybody. They're immoral and they're going to hurt everybody. And, decades on, the exact patterns they predicted were happening. One of the idea of combining, finding this meeting point between racial justice and environmental justice. First of all, I would just want to give an acknowledgement that there are a number of people who are there and who I learned from and who have been working on these things in this intersection for many decades. And but I think there's it does also give me pause about how about why isn't there more of that fusion. And I have a number of thoughts going in my head. One is, I think when people think of the way we divide place, when we think of core cities, it's predominantly people of color, and when people think of suburbs and rural areas, they predominantly think of white people. That's how I know that's not the strict pattern, but it's sort of the perception and a pattern. And when people think of environmentalism, they don't think of cities, and this is true of me too. I care about the environment, but as a journalist, I wrote a lot about cities, like Detroit, where I live, and other cities like it especially. It took me a while to sort of start realizing that that's not the opposite of being an environmental reporter, right? The environment isn't just rural landscapes, right? It's not just forests and oceans. It includes our built environment. It includes, the way we interact in nature in dense neighborhoods. But I think the sort of myth, the sort of we have this sort of myth that they're two separate realms, and to focus on one is to not focus on the other. And because we've placed places in a segregated pattern that's often followed racial patterns. So when you look at environmental organizations, there are a lot of white people, I don't think that's a coincidence. And when we talk about why weren't people there sooner in Flint with these rising, escalating, serious life and death issues with the water, it's not just state workers and federal workers that we might critique. It's also where were the environmental organizations? Where were other universities, including their were like natural resources departments, including those campuses that were in Flint? Where were other journalists, including environmental journalists, including myself, who was an hour drive away, A lot of us should have been there sooner. And I think the consequences of that delay shows how urgent it is to sort of reconceive of the narratives we have around what a city is and what the environment is, because that's not because people live in those are the separateness of that is as false as any redlined map we have that divides space by race. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And what it leads me to is that, and you point this out very clearly in your book, that it wasn't until white families began to say that they were being impacted, because for a long time, black families were saying that, and they were going to the city council or to the authorities with their dirty water. Or saying that their kids had these rashes or hair was falling out. And it was when a couple of white mothers began to articulate this, and white communities or white people in the community began to be impacted, that people began to hear and to listen.
It's literally true. And if you talk to folks, they were very strategic about that. That wasn't even just a coincidence. After a long time of not getting any response, to a number of concerns, despite more and more information. They started very purposefully putting in front, as the white mothers, the white married mothers that were in their family, who were tremendously talented and committed organizers who were genuinely harmed by it, but they were also, but it wasn't a coincidence that they were forefronted, and it wasn't a coincidence that is when the narrative started shifting, because suddenly it starts fitting into people's fitting a little bit closer to people's stereotypes of how an environmental injustice happens. It looks a little more like the Aaron Brockovich story or something like that. People have a capacity of empathy for these, this is certain profile of person that they do not apparently have, for people who are of different races or of different life situations, or, it's just, they don't have that same level of sympathy, as evidenced by the fact that they didn't act.
Yeah. And it continues the pattern which you point to historically, that when we think about where certain things are built, sewer sites, dumping sites, that they're where we think of where we dispose of things that need to be disposed of, they are put in the areas with people who we consider disposable people.
It's absolutely true. It's just true. People have been documenting this for decades. It's when we divide when we divide land up and we say that this parcel of land is worth less, not metaphorically, literally worth less, in large part because of the race of the people who live there, then suddenly, that distorts all the kind of equations people are going to later calculate about where should we put this dump site, or where should we put this landfill, or whatever it is, what do we tear down to build this highway. When they look at the numbers, they're oh, that neighborhood has less value, because they set it up that way, right? The system set it up so that in this fashion, so that the land is worth less the second a person of color moves there. That's the origin of our segregated system. And just one too. It's you can't, even neighborhoods that were redlined also included mostly white neighborhoods that had just a few people of color. It was considered it can either be a black neighborhood or white neighborhood. It can't be both. It can't be both. And they set that up in a way that so those neighborhoods were going to be not have the same access to like loans for not just mortgages but equity loans. They weren't going to have this infrastructure invested in the same way, and they weren't able to like thrive in the same way, and they weren't able to pass down generational wealth in the same way. And so suddenly, like, when you make these kind of calculations, and you keep finding out that the neighborhood with a lot of people of color is the one that's worth less, to put a toxic dump there or whatever it is, it's like you got to understand. It's preposterous to not look at the context that set that pattern up, right? It's like, because it's not a coincidence, and it takes, just as it was very purposefully created, it has to be very purposefully uncreated, or we're going to keep seeing this pattern play out.
So let me follow up on that a bit of sort of what gets handed down generationally. You have very clearly, and the Flint story has very clearly let us know, thank you, that the children were poisoned. Yeah. The most vulnerable in the community were poisoned. But the reality of the situation continues is that the children are poisoned. And so that it continues to impact their lives, regardless of what changes may occur now in the water treatment and no longer having high levels of lead, but the children are poisoned. And it has an impact upon their behavior. It has an impact upon their ability to learn. And so these are the issues, the collateral damage and the generational damage that live on from a water crisis such as lead poisoning. How do we begin to lift up the impact of the ongoing impact of lead poisoning, particularly as we look at what is happening with these very children within the educational system in schools? Instead of it being treated as a health crisis in terms of their ability to learn and behavioral issues, and it is a health crisis because lead influences that, it's being responded to in a punitive way. How is this being addressed? Have you seen this being addressed? How should we address it?
Yeah, it's huge. This is one of the things people mean when they say the Flint water crisis isn't over. I mean, there's some very technical reasons they say that. Like, for example, not all those corroded pipes are replaced yet. That's going to take a while longer. But in a bigger way, there is this like permanent legacy. I mean, this is what is so insidious about lead in particular. It gets into your blood, and then your bones, and then your brain, and and especially for these like tiny little developing bodies, it doesn't affect everybody the same way. Some people, like, there'll be no obvious symptoms, but to a certain extent, we really have to wait for these kids to grow up to see what the consequences are for them. And this is an entire generation of a city's children exposed through this uptick of lead in their water, but also, because this is a pattern, also more lead than they should be exposed to through old houses with unremediated paint, and lead that's still in the soil from leaded fuel. I mean, the exposures are cumulative and incurable and permanent, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. There have been some folks who have, some scientists who are like trying to make the argument that we shouldn't say that the kids in Flint had been lead poisoned because it's stigmatizing, and they want to say like lead exposed because we don't really know what all the consequences are, and we don't want them to grow up thinking they have no potential. And I'm sympathetic to that point, to a point, because they shouldn't be stigmatized because they didn't do anything wrong. But they were actually poisoned, and acknowledging that is important, and I think a really crucial step. That honesty, I think, is a crucial step for anything that comes next. One thing that is good that has happened in Flint that has not happened in other cities that have also had lead crises is the spotlight was so big that it led to a great deal of money, both from public and philanthropic sources that have invested in some really innovative wraparound kind of programs. There's this like brand new school that was built in Flint called EduCare. It's available to any kid like 0 through 6 years old. And besides being a sort of childcare / preschool, it's they offer like a variety of social services. Everybody there is like trained to keep an eye on like kids who might, have like signs of like lead poisoning. It's built in this like brand new building. It's probably the first new school that was built in Flint in 50 years. And it's meeting a need that was there even before the water crisis, like early childhood education and a number of nutrition stuff. There's also, something called the Flint Registry that the medical community has been like working on, trying to, basically keep track of every kid exposed to the water, certainly the kids who grew up in Flint, but also the ones who were there during the water crisis and their families moved, also the kids who like maybe live in the suburbs but were like in Flint a lot for some particular program or something like that. Any kid who is like exposed to this water, they're like putting on this like kind of registry that's like meant to, connect a variety of different kind of service programs to make sure they have as much like help and support as they need. There's a number of nutrition programs because like they are known that some like particular like good nutrition doesn't remove the lead, but it does mitigate some of the effects. And because it's a city that is a food desert in many ways, again, this is like kind of meeting a need. And they also had this is through the federal government, like expanded Medicare, they sort of like they had like they basically have Medicare for all in Flint, which is great for a lot of reasons, even as separate from the water crisis. So the good news is there's a lot of people who've been doing a lot of things to look out for the long-term future of these kids, but there's also this like huge question mark that's still there because we don't know really what it's going to look like when they get older. I suspect harder questions may come up. Lead's associated with like things like more impulsive behavior and antisocial behavior. It's connected with like crime in a lot of studies. Like what happens like if kids get older and affected by like this lead, like are causing problems in the community and hurting other people in the community. I mean, like, will we still have a capacity for empathy for them then as we do when they're cute little 3-year-olds? We'll see, I think there's a lot of, and also like 10 years down the road when like when the intensity of the drama of the story isn't with us in the same way, the public and political pressure isn't with us the same way, like, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that's one of the reasons it was hard to finish this is because there's a lot I do not know. I kind of want to stick around and just see.
Quick question. Well, you're answering a number of the questions at once that are coming in, but one quick question. Person wants to know, what was the percentage? Do you know the percentage of children that were impacted by the lead poisoning in Flint?
I don't have an immediate percentage for you, but I'm just going to say all of them. Like seriously, I mean, the things. One of the problems, and this came up a lot with like Flint's story, is that there's a number of reasons why we don't have like a completely accurate, objective measure, and like one is that especially during nearly 2 years of denial about like the water crisis, like people weren't necessarily going out of their way to get tested for lead. Lead didn't even come up among the series of problems until the last like 6 months of the, escalating water problems. Two, with lead, when you get tested for lead, like if it catches a high amount of lead in a child, that means that means it's still in your blood, which means it's only been it's gotten in you. It's like basically it's like you've come in contact with it in the past like 30 days. Once it starts getting into your bones and brains, it's not detectable. So who even we don't even really know. This is like one of the problems. The uncertainty of the legacy of this water crisis is part of the harm that's done. So yes, like there are actual kids who were actually lead poisoned, and we do have numbers that prove it. But even beyond that, every kid who is exposed to this water, and again, not just through drinking, but also through brushing their teeth and all the other ways that we come in contact with water in our lives, like they're affected by it because this shadow is with them for the rest of their lives. Like if they have learning difficulties when they become eighth graders, like their parent will forever wonder, like maybe that was just going to happen anyway. That happens sometimes, or was it because of the water? That you don't really know, and that the mystery of that, like that's one thing that stays with me the most. So many people I talk to, just like look back and they're questioning everything, like for themselves and for their kids, and regardless of whether or not it's true or ever can be known as true, it's the wondering, the mistrust, the ghosts of it that are ever present and traumatizing.
Let me pick up on that word mistrust and combine a couple of questions here. And that is the deep well, as you've spoken about earlier in another conversation, of mistrust. And one of the things that we see in the Flint water crisis is the way in which the government betrayed the people in the community of Flint, and even the ways in which they colluded with the scientific community in this betrayal and creating this whole pattern of betrayal and mistrust. And so how, when we're talking about solutions to the problem, how are the people ever to trust science and trust the government? And did you see, to tag in another question, did you see any difference in terms of the political response? Was there a difference in terms of political parties, partisanship, et cetera, in responding to the water crisis? Or was it across the board in the way in which the government failed the people?
Yeah, these are big questions. That's just part of what's kind of heartbreaking. And it was difficult writing this too. We're living in a time where there's a lot of pushback against the EPA and environmental regulations and public health regulations and water stuff. And writing this, like, you can is showing them at their worst, basically, and it's hard. Like I don't want like people to read the book and take away from it the fact that, like, oh, we should just get rid of our environmental quality departments and our EPAs and they're the worst. What we need is for them to be better, more resourced and better, and put the public good first. All of which were a problem in this particular case. So the people who have the bulk of responsibility in Flint, it's generally acknowledged at this point, is like the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Health and Human Services. So two public institutions that should be putting the environment and public health first. And it was a series of decisions that led to this crisis. And like in that sense, like there's the partisan questions a little bit separate. I mean, some of that comes up later, but like a little bit of that separate, in the sense that, what was it within these institutions that led them to be so blind with the city for so long? And, I don't have a great answer to it, but like some of it is, I think like, like this sort of like inherited sense that this wasn't a city to go to bat for, like that was explicitly said in one EPA email, actually. Like, I'm not sure if Flint is the kind of community we need to go out on a limb for, is what they said when they were debating whether or not to provide emergency water filters. I think also there's this sort of, bureaucracy as a disguise, like nobody particularly felt responsible because everybody's kind of responsible, so it's just, it sort of like got its own sort of inertia that way. Especially the DEQ had been under, if we want to get partisan, like especially under the Republican leadership, had like lost a lot of staffing and resources. They were less equipped to do a good job in the first place. I mean, they could have done better than they did for sure, but like they were I think like had a lot of motivation to choose whatever was the easiest or simplest response and at any given point, and that was usually to pretend like nothing was wrong. Like who wants to open up the box of things you'd have to do if you acknowledge it's a problem? But there's also the emergency management piece too, and that goes straight to the governor or previous governor, actually. Emergency management has been in Michigan for a long time, and both Republican and Democratic leaders have used it, but it was greatly expanded under our previous administration, Governor Rick Snyder. And the Republican legislature. What happened was what they wanted to do was to expand the emergency management law so you had more authority and it was easier to send an EM to a community. It was almost certainly they were making these changes in order to in preparation for Detroit's bankruptcy. They wanted an emergency manager in place during the bankruptcy that had a lot of power. But they also started sending more and more. The system was used much more and more frequently. But it was such an expansion of powers that enough community organizers throughout the state got it on the ballot. We voted on it. Communities all across the state voted against it. It was rejected. And then in the lame duck legislature, an almost identical version of the law became law again, but this time with money attached to it, appropriations, which made it immune from another referendum. So in that sense, it wasn't just people in the city of Flint whose votes were sidelined. They just went ahead and did this law even though the voters had rejected it, basically. And this emergency management system, disproportionately is affecting not just communities that are people of color and poor, but also Democratic communities, I think is interesting. They lose the power of their local votes. And because we have been a very gerrymandered state, I think one reason that it took Flint an inordinately long time to get anybody in Lansing to hear them is because there's fewer people in office there who felt they needed to be accountable to them, right? Responsive to them, not for a number of reasons. And, I think for a number of reasons, and one of which I think is maybe partisan. And anyway, among the things that have happened in the wake of the Flint water crisis, there have been, because of a class action settlement, the pipes are being replaced. There's some of these, this nice school and all that. There's some technical changes with our water laws in the state. That's great. One thing that has not changed is our emergency manager law. That's still on the books. Despite people being quite clear that if there wasn't one, this would not have happened. It wouldn't have. It just wouldn't have.
We have time for a couple of real quick questions. I want to take a turn, and you open the book with the activism from the pastor from, I guess, Joy Tabernacle, and the faith community plays a role in what's going on in Flint. So I want to ask you, what ways do you see that the faith community can be more engaged and should be more engaged?
Within Flint or beyond Flint?
Well, both. But in the water crisis.
Well, yeah, one thing that's true is Flint is a very churched community. It is. One of the things that's still very present now is churches, and they are neighborhood centers. They are neighborhood hubs, and have a great deal of leaders of those communities have a great deal of trust and credibility. And also, it has provided a kind of structure and community that people have needed as vacancy has come to plague a lot of the neighborhoods they once called home. Their communities have been scarred, right? And so, but they can keep finding this home in these anchor institutions. So, even before the water crisis, a lot of these folks are providing, filling the gaps that have been met, not just serving people's spiritual lives, but also, meeting immediate needs of food and social service assistance and counseling and things like that, and taking people to the hospital when they need to be taken to the hospital. I know folks who've done that, and during the water crisis, it was a very natural extension for many of them to become organizing hubs, So there's a Catholic church called St. Michael's. That was where people frequently met. There's a church called Woodside Church that is Christian affiliated. I'm not actually sure, like, which, I think it's very ecumenical. They very early on had, like, developed a committee, like a water task force to, like, help meet the needs in the community, but also, like, in their own church community, but also, like, be, like, sort of front facing and, work with other folks to kind of investigate what was going on. Church basements were like places where people were turning in their like neighborhood water samples. They provided space, these like younger and innovative churches like Joy Tabernacle were, like knew how to reach people in their community that nobody else could meet, nobody else could reach in the same way. So like when finally there was some acknowledgement of the water crisis and, canvassing, like the National Guard was activated to go door to door to like, deliver bottled water and filters and things like that. That was a good effort. I'm glad the state was doing it, but it's not everybody's going to open the door to that. They don't necessarily know where to go. A lot of houses look empty that are not actually empty, and like these folks who have, who are stakeholders in the community, who know the community, who look like the members of their own community, like we're able to be more effective advocates at this critical emergency time, where time really is of the essence. And I think that's like really powerful. And if we're thinking of like ways to like kind of grow and like what more people can do, well, first of all, like I'm pausing because, like, honestly, I'm kind of like wowed by what people are already doing, often with very little resources and support. But I like one thing that like I appreciate, like one thing that seems really effective is how a lot of partnerships are happening. Different communities are partnering in different ways. Neighborhoods that have not always seen themselves in each other are connecting. That Civic Park community has a wonderful liaison, like somebody who's like both part of the community and also teaches at University of Michigan Flint. And what they're doing is they're home to a class, a university class where half the students are members of the community and students also, and they're like working together in ways that they haven't worked together before. Like basically they're creating the structures that they need in a long-term, that don't just meet immediate needs, but present a long-term vision for how to stitch a community back together that has been so riven.
So we'll end with this. What would you like us to take away from your book?
Well, if you get a chance to go to Flint, you should go. Like, I actually do recommend that. I mean, there's a lot of like joy and inspiration, and a lot that's super, super hard, and a lot that I try to communicate in the book, but some things you just got to be there and meet these folks yourself, So that's the very first thing that comes to mind. Like, if you get a chance to be present there, like, go do it. There's also a wonderful bookstore. It's called Totem, and you should go there. Anyway, but beyond that, I guess, like, I would just like hope that the book, if this book were like helped to inspire people to reimagine their own communities as places that were more inclusive and more just, if we were able to like think about infrastructure in a way that was something that could. As a force that can, stitch together a community rather than separate a community. I feel like it could be very powerful, and I would love to just like watch and learn as people like adapt, the best lessons that have come out of the community organizers in Flint to their own homes, and not in ways that like not just make sure that we all have healthy, safe, clean, affordable water, but also are just like more that are places where we can thrive in every other way too.
Thank you for this evening. Thank you all, and it is a powerful book. It's about Flint and more, and so if you have not yet read the book, it is a must read. So thank you and stay warm.